They said she was just another bride seeking security, but she carried the heart of a guardian. Clara Whitmore stepped off the dusty stagecoach into the harsh afternoon sun of Redemption Creek, her traveling dress wrinkled from 3 days of bone-jarring travel across the Colorado Territory. The smell of leather, horse sweat, and something sharper, gunpowder, hung in the dry air. Her gloved hands clutched a worn carpet bag containing everything she owned, while her eyes searched the wooden storefronts and weathered faces for the man who had summoned her west through carefully written letters. Sheriff Jake Morrison stood in the shadow of his office doorway, badge catching the light like a signal mirror. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. He was taller than she had imagined, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and careful eyes that missed nothing. The crease in his hat brim was precise, his boots polished despite the dust that coated everything else in this frontier town. When their gazes met across the rutted main street, Clara felt something unexpected flutter in her chest, not the nervous dread she had carried for weeks, but a curious warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Jake Morrison had not expected beauty. Her letters had been practical, mentioning her age, 26, her lack of family, and her willingness to keep house for a lawman in exchange for protection and respectability. What stepped from that stagecoach was a woman with intelligent brown eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves, carefully pinned but with rebellious strands that had escaped during her journey. She moved with quiet grace despite her obvious weariness, and when she smiled tentatively in his direction, something long frozen in his chest began to thaw. Their introduction was formal, conducted under the curious gazes of townspeople who had nothing better to do than watch their sheriff collect his mail-order bride. Clara's handshake was firm, her voice steady as she thanked him for sending the travel money. Jake found himself tongue-tied, hat in hand, acutely aware that this woman had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger because she had nowhere else to go. The parsonage was small but tidy, with windows that faced both the sunrise and the mountains beyond. Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, had prepared it with care, fresh curtains, a jar of wildflowers on the table, bread still warm from her oven. Clara moved through the rooms with careful steps, touching surfaces lightly as if to convince herself this place might become home. Their wedding ceremony 3 days later was witnessed by half the town, not from affection but from curiosity. Judge Crawford spoke the words quickly, as if speed might make the awkwardness less pronounced. When Jake was instructed to kiss his bride, he barely brushed her cheek, and Clara's answering smile was gentle but guarded. They were strangers performing the motions of intimacy, and everyone present knew it. Yet in the days that followed, something real began to grow between them like grass pushing through desert hardpan. Clara proved to be more than the practical housekeeper she had promised to be. She tended Jake's shirts with care, darning tears from his dangerous work with tiny, precise stitches. She learned to cook the simple meals he preferred, finding satisfaction in the way his eyes would close briefly when he tasted something particularly good. Most surprisingly, she began to wait for him in the evenings, a cup of coffee ready, genuine interest in her questions about his day. Jake discovered that his new wife possessed a quick mind and a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually as her wariness faded. She read voraciously, borrowing books from anyone who would lend them, and her observations about the townspeople were often more perceptive than his own. When she laughed, really laughed, not the polite sounds she made in public, it transformed her entire face, making him realize how carefully she had been guarding herself. The danger that was always present in Jake's work became Clara's constant companion. She learned to recognize the signs of trouble in his posture when he returned home, the way his hand would rest unconsciously on his gun when certain names came up in conversation. She began to understand that being married to the law in a place like Redemption Creek meant living with the knowledge that any day might be their last together. The Caldwell gang had been terrorizing the territory for months, robbing banks and stagecoaches with increasing boldness. Their leader, Dutch Caldwell, was a man who took personal offense at any challenge to his authority, and Sheriff Jake Morrison had become a particular thorn in his side. Word came through various channels that Caldwell had put a price on Jake's head, enough money to tempt even previously honest men. Clara noticed the change immediately. Jake became more watchful, checking the street before stepping outside, insisting she avoid certain parts of town. He tried to hide his concern, but she saw it in the way he cleaned his weapons with extra care each evening, in the set of his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. Fear became a third presence in their small home, uninvited but undeniably there. Their relationship deepened in the face of this shared anxiety. Jake began to confide in her about the complexities of frontier justice, the impossible choices between law and mercy that kept him awake at night. Clara listened without judgment, her presence a steady comfort that he had never known he needed. She, in turn, began to share pieces of her past, the poverty that had driven her west, the loneliness that had made marriage to a stranger seem like her best option. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, they found themselves sitting closer than usual on their small porch. The air smelled of wood smoke and the approaching change of season. Jake was mending a piece of harness, his hands steady despite the fading light, while Clara worked on embroidering pillowcases, a domestic touch that made their house feel more like a home. "Do you regret it?" Jake asked suddenly, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "Coming here, I mean. Marrying someone you didn't know." Clara's needle paused in its movement. She considered the question seriously, as she considered most things. I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, she said finally. But not the choice itself. You're a good man, Jake Morrison. Better than I had any right to hope for. The simple honesty of her words hit him like a physical blow. He looked up from his work to find her watching him with an expression that was no longer guarded, no longer careful. Something had shifted between them without either of them noticing exactly when, and the realization left them both slightly breathless. Clara, he began, but she shook her head gently. We don't need to name it, she said. Not yet. But I want you to know that when I worry about your safety, it's not because I'm afraid of being alone again. It's because I'm afraid of losing you. The confession hung between them in the cooling air, profound in its simplicity. Jake reached over and took her hand, calloused fingers intertwining with smooth ones, and they sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared overhead. The attack came on a Tuesday morning in early October. Jake was making his usual rounds, checking in with the shopkeepers and observing the daily rhythm of the town. Clara was in the general store, selecting fabric for winter curtains, when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of running feet, someone shouting Jake's name with urgency. She abandoned her fabric and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk just as Jake emerged from the bank across the street. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand had moved instinctively to his gun. The crowd that had gathered was pointing toward the far end of town, where dust clouds suggested approaching riders. The Caldwell gang rode into Redemption Creek like a plague of locusts, 6 men with hard eyes and brass confidence. They positioned themselves strategically throughout the town, cutting off escape routes with the precision of a military operation. Dutch Caldwell himself dismounted directly in front of the sheriff's office, his spurs ringing against the wooden walkway with each deliberate step. Morrison, his voice carried clearly in the suddenly still air. Time to settle our differences like men. You and me, right here in the street. No hiding behind that badge of yours. Clara felt her heart stop. She had never seen Dutch Caldwell before, but his reputation preceded him, a man who had killed more law officers than anyone cared to count, who treated violence like an art form he had mastered. Jake was skilled, but he was also outnumbered and facing someone with nothing left to lose. Jake stepped into the street with the steady calm that had made him an effective sheriff. His badge caught the morning sun as he faced the man who had been haunting their nights with threats and fears. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, shopkeepers and citizens alike finding whatever cover they could while still maintaining a view of the confrontation. You want to face me, Caldwell? I'm here, Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office. But let's do this away from innocent people. Caldwell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Innocent people? In this hole? There ain't no such thing, Sheriff. Besides, I want everyone to see what happens to lawmen who get too big for their britches. Clara found herself moving without conscious thought, stepping off the sidewalk and into the street. Every instinct screamed at her to take cover, to hide, to let the men settle their business with violence as men always seem to do. But stronger than survival was the knowledge that she could not stand by and watch Jake face this alone. She positioned herself where she could see both men clearly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jake's eyes flicked to her briefly, and she saw fear there, not for himself, but for her safety. She gave him the smallest nod, hoping he would understand that she needed to be there, that running away would be worse than whatever might happen next. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Caldwell's hand hovered over his gun, his smile predatory and confident. Jake remained still as stone, waiting for his opponent to make the first move. The silence was broken only by the whisper of wind through the wooden buildings and the distant sound of a crow calling from somewhere beyond the town. What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats. Caldwell's hand moved toward his gun with practiced speed, but his eyes shifted at the last second, not to Jake, but to something behind him. Clara saw the flash of sunlight on metal from a second-story window across the street, recognized the shape of a rifle barrel aimed not at Caldwell but at Jake's back. The betrayal was perfect in its simplicity. While everyone watched the dramatic confrontation in the street, a hidden gunman prepared to shoot the sheriff from behind. Caldwell's challenge had been nothing more than theater, a way to position Jake exactly where the assassin needed him. Clara didn't think. Thinking would have reminded her that she was a small woman with no weapons, no training, no business interfering in a gunfight. Thinking would have paralyzed her with fear. Instead, she acted on pure instinct, launching herself across the dusty space between herself and Jake just as the rifle cracked from above. The bullet meant for Jake's heart struck Clara high in the chest, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust and blood. Pain exploded through her body like lightning, but even as she fell, she heard Jake's gun answer the hidden rifle, heard the crash of glass and a man scream from the window above. Jake's roar of rage and grief echoed off the building walls as he spun to see Clara crumpled in the dirt. Caldwell, caught off guard by the turn of events, went for his gun anyway, but Jake's fury made him faster than he had ever been. His bullet found its mark before Caldwell could clear leather, dropping the outlaw leader where he stood. The rest of the gang, seeing their leader dead and their plan shattered, scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Jake barely noticed. He was already kneeling beside Clara, his hands shaking as he tried to assess her wound. Blood stained the front of her dress, spreading in a dark flower that made his vision blur with panic. Clara, stay with me, he whispered, gathering her into his arms. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her breathing shallow and rapid. Why did you do that? Why? Her lips moved, and he had to lean close to hear her words. "Because I love you," she whispered, each word an effort. "Because you're worth saving." Dr. Hartwell worked on Clara for 3 hours while Jake paced the hallway outside his office like a caged animal. The bullet had missed her heart by inches, but had done considerable damage to her lung and shoulder. Her survival was far from certain, and even if she lived, her recovery would be long and difficult. The town rallied around their sheriff and his wounded wife in a way that surprised everyone, including Jake. Mrs. Henderson organized meals and helped with the household. Men who had barely spoken to Clara before took turns sitting vigil outside the doctor's office. Children drew pictures to brighten her room when she was finally moved to the parsonage to recover. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness for days, her fever rising and falling like ocean tides. Jake rarely left her side, holding her hand during the worst moments, talking to her about anything and everything when she seemed more aware. He told her about his childhood, his fears, his dreams for their future together. He promised her a better house, trips to Denver, whatever she wanted if she would just stay with him. When she finally opened her eyes and stayed awake long enough to focus on his face, Jake felt as if he had been granted a miracle. Her first word was his name, spoken in a voice rough from disuse but filled with warmth. Her second was an apology for scaring him, which made him laugh and cry at the same time. "Don't you ever do anything like that again," he said, pressing her hand to his lips. "Do you hear me? Nothing is worth losing you." Clara's smile was weak but genuine. "I'd do it again," she whispered. Every time. Her recovery was slow, marked by small victories and occasional setbacks. Jake learned to be patient in a way his nature had never required before. He helped her with simple tasks, read to her when she was too tired to hold a book, and discovered that taking care of someone you loved was both the most difficult and most rewarding thing he had ever done. The scar on Clara's chest would fade with time, but it would never disappear completely. Jake found it beautiful, a testament to her courage and her love. When she was strong enough to resume her household duties, she moved differently, more carefully, but with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She had proven to herself and to everyone else that she was capable of extraordinary bravery when it mattered most. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, had been transformed by crisis into something deeper and more genuine than either had dared to hope for. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen to stay. They had faced the possibility of loss and emerged grateful for what they had found together. On Christmas Eve, nearly 3 months after the shooting, Jake found Clara standing by their window, watching snow fall on the quiet streets of Redemption Creek. The white blanket softened the harsh edges of the frontier town, making it look peaceful and almost innocent in the lamplight. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind, careful of her still healing shoulder. Clara leaned back against his chest, solid and warm and reassuringly alive. "I was thinking about how strange life is," she said softly. "How the worst thing that ever happened to me, having to leave everything I knew to marry a stranger, led to the best thing. Finding you. Finding us." Jake pressed his face into her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of the lavender water she favored. "I used to think love was something that happened to other people," he admitted. "Something I was too practical for, too set in my ways. I never imagined it could feel like this." She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. The lamplight caught the gold in her brown eyes, making them shine like precious stones. "What does it feel like?" "Like coming home," he said simply. "Like being willing to take a bullet for someone, and knowing they'd do the same for you." Clara smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy and contentment. "Then we understand each other perfectly." Outside, the snow continued to fall on Redemption Creek, covering the places where blood had been spilled and violence had threatened to destroy everything good and hopeful. Inside their small home, Jake and Clara Morrison held each other close, two people who had found in each other something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth cherishing for all the days they had been granted together. The frontier could be a harsh and unforgiving place, but it could also be where unlikely love stories unfolded, where strangers became soulmates, and where a woman's courage could transform duty into devotion. Clara had come west seeking security and found something infinitely more valuable, a love worth taking a bullet for, and a man who would spend the rest of his life being grateful that she had.